In a previous shiur, the rabbi discussed HaRav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook's attitude towards the Mizrachi movement. What happened after Rav Kook's passing?
In a previous shiur, we examined the attitude of HaRav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook Zetzal, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, to the political movement known as the Mizrachi movement, which defined itself as a religious Zionist movement. And we saw, based on a number of letters that Rav Kook wrote during the first 17, 18 years of the 20th century, Leminyanam, that Rav Kook, far from identifying fully with the Mizrachi movement, which is what most people imagine, and based on what most people have heard, far from identifying with that movement, he was very ambivalent towards it and was rather critical of it on more than one occasion. In the wake of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, Leminyanam, Rav Kook for the first time expressed his view that it was now necessary, seeing that he had observed the activities of the Mizrachi movement and was becoming increasingly aware that they were not fulfilling what he considered to be their purpose and their destiny in Hashem's world, which was to clearly enunciate the need for a clear ideological and spiritual direction for the Zionist movement, for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland. Having observed that the Mizrachi was not up to this and was unwilling to do so, he for the first time discussed the need for a different movement, an organization that he named Degel Yerushalayim, in other words, literally the banner of Jerusalem. Rav Kook wrote a number of open letters on this subject, the equivalent of a press release in our day, announcing this intention of his firm belief that such a movement was required, was essential. He even sent his son, HaRav Tzvila Kook, to Europe to speak to various great Rabbanim and Hasidic leaders in order that they should express their support for such a movement and for the need for such a development. But the response was very mealy-mouthed, to put it mildly. And in fact, this movement, Degel Yerushalayim, that Rav Kook envisaged, never in fact took form and shape in this world. It never came to fruition. With regards to the Yeshiva that Rav Kook founded in Jerusalem, Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav, the Central Universal Yeshiva, that is the official term, Yeshiva HaMerkazit HaOlamit. Rav Kook himself gave it this name. This yeshiva was established in Tafresh Pedared, Tafresh Pehei, 1924, 1925, according to the Gregorian calendar. And it began modestly, and over time it grew, so that during the 20s and early 30s, it had several tens of students, at some point perhaps as many as 70. Or maybe even 80 students. And we must be aware of the fact that during those years, the second half of the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s, until Rav Kook passed away at the end of Tafresh Tzadihei, 1935, according to the Gregorian calendar. And during that period of time, the yeshiva, at least outwardly, was no different from other yeshivot in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the student body, the teachers, the rabbanim, the rabbis dressed in the same manner as students and rabbis in other yeshivot. The lingua franca amongst the students, for the most part, was Yiddish. And the yeshiva was, on the one hand, one more yeshiva, but on the other hand, it took a different approach to the study of Torah, a much more comprehensive approach, with a particular emphasis being placed on the study of what eventually became known as Limudei Emunah, that is to say, the systematic study, one should stress, the systematic study of Jewish thought. Some would call it Jewish philosophy. Books such as Mivhar HaDe'ot HaEmunot, HaEmunot HaDe'ot of Rav Saadia Gaon, and the book by Rabbi Rabbeinu Bahya HaDayan, known as Havot HaLevavot, and Moreh Nevuchim of Rambam, and Sefer HaKuzari by Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, and Sefer HaIkarim, etc. These books, such study was stressed in a way that one did not find in other yeshivot. This is true. And nevertheless, the yeshiva was not identified with any political movement, and could not, during that time, have been described as a Zionist yeshiva. And Rav Kook could not be described as a Zionist either, based on everything that we have discussed and the various sources that we quoted. And the reality on the ground during those years. Many of the student body at that time were young men who came to Eretz Yisrael from Eastern Europe, from places such as Russia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, etc., including the grandson of the Chafetz Chaim, who was sent to learn with Rav Kook in his yeshiva in Yerushalayim by the Chafetz Chaim. Rav Kook passed away at the end of Tafresh Tzadihei, 1935, as mentioned, and was succeeded by one of his major Talmidim, one of his earliest Talmidim, Gaon Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Harlap Zetzal, who was a Yerushalmi. He had grown up in Yerushalayim, in Sha'arei Hesed. He was a Talmid of a well-known Rav and a Mekubal in Yerushalayim, and he early on made a connection with Rav Kook. He even traveled from Yerushalayim to Yafo in the early days of of Rav Kook in Eretz Yisrael, to spend time with him, to speak with him, study with him. He became the Rosh Yeshiva and remained the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz HaRav till Shin Yod Bet, 1952, Leminyanam. When HaRav Harlap passed away, the son of Rav Kook, HaRav Tzvi Yehuda Kohen Kook Zetzal, became the Rosh Yeshiva, at the beginning at least, together with Rav Kook's son-in-law, HaRav Shalom Nathan Ra'anan Zetzal. HaRav Tzvi Yehuda Kook was clearly the more dominant figure, and he began to lay out a new path for the yeshiva. We have to understand that at around this time, the time of the establishment of the State of Israel, in Tafshin Het, 1948, Leminyanam, around that time, a number of students began to arrive in the yeshiva. People such as Gaon HaRav Dov Lior, Professor HaRav Nahum Rakover, HaRav Yoshua Rosen, and others. And we should mention in passing that during the time of the War of Independence, as it is known, Milhemet Tashah, there was in fact a serious mahloket, a serious difference of opinion between the Rosh Yeshiva at that time, HaRav Harlap, and HaRav Tzvi Kook. HaRav Tzvi Kook was of the opinion that the students in the yeshiva should actually close their sfarim, close their books, and leave the Beit Midrash and join the army, join the fighting force, fighting the war at that time. Rav Harlap, on the other hand, the Rosh Yeshiva at that time, was of the view that the students should remain in the Beit Midrash, should continue studying Torah, and should not join the army. And this was the position of all the Rosh Yeshivot and all the well-known Rabbanim in the country at that time. Rav Tzila's position was essentially a minority of one. This mahloketh, this difference of opinion between HaRav Harlap and Rav Tzvi led, amongst other factors, to the dwindling of the numbers of Talmidim in the yeshiva. There were also economic factors that led to this state of affairs. And this decline was reversed by the influx of those students that I mentioned a moment ago around the time of the establishment of the state. At this point, we must mention HaRav Moshe Tzvi Neria Zitzal. HaRav Moshe Tzvi Neria was born in Lodz in Poland in Tauresh Ein Gimel, 1913, Leminyanam, and he came to Eretz Yisrael in Tauresh Sadi, 1930, Leminyanam, with the assistance of Rav Kook, who was able to organize the relevant certification and authorization for his aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. Upon his arrival in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Neriya studied in the yeshiva during Rav Kook's time in Merkaz HaRav. He was quite close to Rav Kook, and he also studied in the teachers' seminary run by the Mizrachi movement. And Rav Neriya was, from the very beginning, very active in the Mizrachi movement and in the Bnei Akiva movement. And it was in the year Tau Shin, 1939, according to the Gregorian calendar, that he established, despite the opposition of many people in the Mizrachi and within Bnei Akiva, he established the first Yeshivat Bnei Akiva, which was not at that time yet a Yeshiva Tichonit, a Yeshiva high school. It was a Yeshiva where they both studied agriculture and they worked the land physically every day for a period of time, and also studied Torah, Jewish studies. At the outset, there were no secular studies in this yeshiva. This was known as Yeshivat Kfar HaRo'eh. But because of the demands of parents and others, and despite Rav Neriya's opposition, secular studies were eventually added to the curriculum. So, in effect, it rapidly became the first Yeshiva Tichonit, the first Yeshiva high school in history, Yeshivat Kfar HaRo'eh. Rav Neriya went on to establish other yeshivot, Bnei Akiva yeshivot and ulpanot for young women, for high school age girls. And he established what became known as Merkaz Yeshivot Bnei Akiva, the umbrella organization of all the Bnei Akiva affiliated yeshivot and ulpanot in the country. And because of these activities, and his activities within the Bnei Akiva movement, Rav Neriya became known as Avi Dor HaKippot HaSrugot, the father of the Kippot HaSrugot generation, the knitted kippah generation, which was an invention, a new development of the Mizrachi and Bnei Akiva, this knitted kippah, which was distinct from the other kinds of head coverings that had been worn by Jewish men till that time. HaRav Neriya was, as mentioned earlier, very active in the Bnei Akiva movement, and in fact became essentially the leader of Bnei Akiva, and all the students that began to arrive at the Yeshiva that he established in Kfar HaRo'eh were of a Mizrachi and Bnei Akiva persuasion. That was their family background, that was their experience, and this is why he became known as the father of the Kippot HaSrugot. But it should be noted that HaRav Tzvi Yehuda, the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz HaRav, was not entirely happy with Rav Neriya's connection to Bnei Akiva, because this was a mixed youth group. In other words, both young men and young women, boys and girls, were educated and instructed and involved in various activities together, boys and girls together, and this was, as Rav Tzvi Yehuda made plain, not in keeping with the halacha. This is also something that Rav Kook wrote about in his day, and this was therefore a certain point of contention between Rav Neria and Rav Tzvi Yehuda. Now, following the establishment of the state, and in the wake of that difference of opinion between HaRav Halap, the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz HaRav at that time, and HaRav Tzvi Yehuda regarding the possibility that students should cease their studies in the yeshiva and join the army, the yeshiva experienced its lowest point, essentially. The number of students dropped drastically to the point that around the year Tavshin Yod 1950, and in the year or two following that, the number of students in the yeshiva was at most 20 in total. And this decline was eventually reversed, slowly at first, by the influx of a new type of student. That is to say, students from a distinctly Mizrachi and Bnei Akiva background, many of whom were graduates of the first Bnei Akiva Yeshiva in Kfar HaRo'eh, established by Rav Neria. Around that time, in the early 50s, HaRav Neria and HaRav Chaim Drukman and others began to funnel more and more students of Mizrachi Bnei Akiva background to Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav in Yerushalayim. These were people from a distinctly religious Zionist background, very different from the kinds of homes and education that the previous generation of students of the yeshiva had represented. And this influx of students from the religious Zionist world slowly but surely increased over time. And nevertheless, the yeshiva remained a small operation throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. About 8 or 10 months ago, I myself heard, during a conversation with Rav Yol bin Nun, that when Rav Yol bin Nun, arrived in the yeshiva in Tavshin Kaf Gimel, Elul Tavshin Kaf Gimel, 1963 Leminyanam, that was the first year that a significant number of students arrived as first-year students and really boosted the numbers in the yeshiva. He related to me that that year there were 30 students in the new crop of young Talmidim at that time, and he mentioned to me how Rav Ra'anan, who was in charge of accepting and dealing with the new students, was essentially almost in a state of shock. He expressed the fact that they were used to having 7 or 8 new students per year, and all of a sudden they had 30 that year, and frankly they didn't know what to do with them. They didn't know where to put them. They didn't have the wherewithal to assimilate such a number of students. This was the situation in the early 60s. Slowly but surely, during the 1960s, the yeshiva began to grow, but it was still a fairly modest operation. And this only began to change after Milchemet Sheshet Yamim, the Six-Day War in Taushin Kavzai, 1967, Minyanam. So it was, in fact, in the second half of the 1950s, and then in the 1960s, that the Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav, began slowly but surely to grow. The number of students began to increase. But now, overwhelmingly, these students were from a Mizrachi, Bnei Akiva, religious Zionist background, something which was certainly not the case prior to that time. And a further development that needs to be mentioned here is that the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz HaRav, at that time, HaRav Rav Kook, became more and more openly associated with and affiliated with the Mizrachi movement. Not, one should stress, not with the Bnei Akiva movement, which, for the reasons that we mentioned, he opposed, but with the Mizrachi movement as a ideological and even as a political movement and party, the what was called the Mafdal, the National Zionist Religious Party. Rav Tzvi became more and more openly identified with that sector of Israel's population. And this only became more obvious and more plain for all to see in the wake of the Six-Day War. In the years following Milchemet Sheshet Yamim, the Six-Day War, there were a number of attempts to establish new Jewish towns and villages in various parts of the country, in the newly liberated parts of Eretz Yisrael. First of all, in Taushin Kavzai in 1967, Kibbutz Kfar Etzion in Gush Etzion, which had been overrun by the Arabs in Taushin Heth 1948, was re-established. Hanan Porat, a student of Merkaz HaRav, was involved and one of the leaders of that development. Similarly, Rav Moshe Levinger established the first Jewish presence in the city of Hebron in the following year. There were other attempts around that time, Taushin Kaftet, Taushin Lamed, Taushin Lamed Aleph, 69, 70, 71, to establish Jewish towns in Samaria, in the Shomeron. The people behind those attempts were again Hanan Porat and Benny Katzelver, Menachem Felix, and others. Those attempts were unfortunately successfully hampered and prevented and blocked by the labor governments of that time, led by Golda Meir. And it was mainly following the Yom Kippur War, at the beginning of Taushin Lamed Daled, 1973, Minyanam, that as a result of the general sense of malaise in the country at that time, and the ideological fervor of a significant portion, I would say at least a half, of the religious Zionist community in Israel, led for the main part, almost exclusively by people from Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav, that these efforts to settle in the Shomeron, in the Samaria, were redoubled in the years following that war, so that in Taushin Lamed Daled, Taushin Lamed Hey, 74, 75, that was when the first successful attempts were made, which eventually led to the many towns and villages in the Shomeron today. So, if we sum up what we have discussed and surveyed, Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav of the time of Rav Kook was most definitely not a Zionist religious institution. Rav Kook himself did not identify as a Zionist. He did support the idea and the necessity, and he viewed it as a tremendous miswa and as a part of the historical return of the Jewish people to their homeland. He did, in fact, view favorably the activities of the various arms of the Zionist movement to resettle the land and build up the country, but he also perceived that without a true and complete connection to the Torah and Jewish tradition, to Hashem, that these activities would flounder. And that is why he felt the need to establish the movement that we mentioned, Degel Yerushalayim, which unfortunately never got off the ground. But the yeshiva, at any rate, was a yeshiva like many other yeshivot in many respects, but also had its own unique characteristics and even curriculum. It was only much later, in the early 50s, and then into the 60s and 70s, that the yeshiva, Merkaz HaRav, became eventually known in Hebrew as Sfinat HaDegel Shel Hatzinut HaDatit, the leading institution representing the Zionist religious community in Israel. The identification of the Zionist religious movement, or again at least a significant part of it, because there were those who opposed these tendencies, the talk about settling the land and the refusal to even discuss any parts of the land of Israel being handed over to the Jewish people's enemies. There were those in the Mizrachi movement who were not ideologically on board with these ideas, but a significant portion of the religious Zionist community in Israel was of this opinion. The leadership, which became known as Gush Emunim, came almost exclusively from Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav, and thus the identification between Mizrachi, the Mafdal, Gush Emunim, and such activities and such ideologies became almost inexorable and inevitable. So the Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav, underwent a major transformation over a period of approximately 2 decades. And this brings us more or less up to the present time. But we should be aware of the fact that there was a definite difference in attitude and approach, and in practical terms, in how to function in the public domain between Rav Kook the father and Rav Kook the son. Rav Kook the father, HaRav Avraham Yitzchak Kohen Kook, was much more independently minded and unwilling to throw in his lot with the Mizrachi movement. He criticized them, and he was never at ease with their activities and their performance on the ground, as he expressed in many letters to the leaders of the Mizrachi movement. His son, HaRav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, on the other hand, perhaps because he found himself the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva, where 90%, if not more, of the student body came from a Mizrachi Bnei Akiva background, he was much more willing to openly identify with that ideology, and thus became almost for all time viewed as one and the same thing. Although in fact Rav Tzvi also, apart from being opposed to Bnei Akiva for the reasons that we mentioned, he was also frequently critical of the Mafdal, who were happy to receive expressions of support from HaRav Tzvi Yehuda Kook when it was to their advantage, but were also quite willing to ignore whatever he had to say on other occasions, even to the point in one particular situation of misrepresenting Rav Tuda's attitude and position regarding joining a certain coalition government in the first part of the 1970s. And this is something that we shall address in another talk. Bezrat Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.